What is theology? Theology simply means the study of God. It combines theo, meaning God, and logia, which is related to the Greek word logos, which has typically been defined as either word and or reason. And so on the most basic level, theology is essentially God talk, or any speech or word about God. In this video, I just want to briefly define theology as I understand it as a Christian theologian, which is that theology is an intellectual discipline that expresses and analyzes the Christian church's faith, hope, and love. Perhaps the most classical definition of theology is the one popularized by Anselm of Canterbury, who called theology faith-seeking understanding. Elsewhere, Anselm writes, "For I do not seek to understand so that I may believe, but I believe so that I may understand." This definition stresses that first there is the experience of faith, and then that faith drives towards understanding. It further articulates how one does not understand without this foundation of faith. Now, that is not to imply that faith supersedes some sort of intellectual rigor. Quite the opposite, actually. It is phrased in this way to suggest that the foundation of theology is this unique faith experience that then leads to the rigorous pursuit of understanding. Faith and understanding are not, in this definition, in conflict with one another, but rather they work together. And so it's faith in the sense that it's not used in the same way that sometimes we talk about belief as belief in something despite evidence. Instead, this definition understands that faith and understanding actually do work together and go hand in hand. This also suggests how theology is not an intellectual effort that tries to work itself up into faith or to convince itself of faith. Theology here is seen rather as a second-order discourse that follows after the reality of faith. And so the first definition I work through is that theology is faith-seeking understanding. Now, theology can also be understood as hope. Jürgen Moltmann has articulated that theology is oriented towards the future coming of God. In his famous Theology of Hope, Moltmann writes, "From first to last, and not merely in the epilogue, Christianity is eschatology, is hope, forward-looking and forward-moving, and therefore also revolutionizing and transforming the present. Theology, therefore, is theologia viatorum, which simply means a theology of pilgrims." And so this indicates how theology is always on the way, that no theology has arrived at the perfect expression of who God is or what the gospel is. Instead, we are all pilgrims hoping and anticipating the coming reign of God in the eschaton, which means theology is, from the beginning, oriented towards the future. This is an understanding of theology that is rooted in the resurrection of Christ. And so theology of hope is then also an iconoclastic theology because it lives unreconciled to the present situation as it anticipates the coming reign of God. It is a prophetic and political theology in that regard, in that it takes this critical edge towards the present situation in its anticipation of the future. And so in that way, theology can be understood as an expression of hope. Now, finally, in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus said that the greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. So when I personally think about theology, I think about it as an intellectual love of God. It is a form of worship, best understood within the context of invocation and prayer. Indeed, Anselm, who defined theology as faith-seeking understanding, also wrote much of his theology in prayer, as a form of prayer, directly invoking God rather than talking about God. Karl Barth writes similarly about the role of awe and wonder in theology. He writes, "A quite specific astonishment stands at the beginning of every theological perception, inquiry, and thought. In fact, at the root of every theological word. This astonishment is indispensable if theology is to exist and be perpetually renewed as a modest, free, critical, and happy science. Whoever begins to concern himself with theology also begins to concern himself from first to last with wonders." And so this captures the sense of theology as a discipline rooted in love, as an intellectual expression of the love of God. Now, this leads to another point. It is also true that the love of God is inseparable from love of neighbor. liberation theologians have often said that to know God is to do justice. And so there's an important aspect within this, that theology is not only God talk, but it is also God walk, as Friedrich Herzog suggested. That identifies the ethical dimension of all theological talk. It's impossible to talk about God without also talking about God's relationship to the world, which entails a ethical and political component. And so these three biblical terms, faith, hope, and love, are a helpful way to think about what theology is, particularly within the Christian sense of the word. Of course, theology, more broadly speaking, can involve any number of religions or ideologies, but my definition here is specifically the Christian one. The Christian sense of theology is that we talk about God because God has first revealed God's self in Jesus Christ. And so the first word of theology is not our word, but it's God's word. It's God speaking to us. And so our God talk, our theology, is possible because God first revealed God's self to us. And so that is why someone like Barth, for example, portrays theology somewhat as an impossibility for human beings. It's an impossibility naturally, but by grace we participate in God's knowledge of God's self, and therefore we're able to actually speak of God. But that's, again, a more Christian definition of theology, specifically a theology rooted in divine revelation. But at the most basic level, theology is any discourse about God. And so in that sense, it can be extremely diverse as a discipline. We can talk about theologies of culture that analyze cultural expressions, such as the religious themes in movies or literature. And so that's why I sometimes describe theology to people as one of the more interdisciplinary subjects that you can study, because at its core, anything can be considered theological or interpreted theologically. And that's also why theology is deeply situated within the humanities, because every human has some kind of theology, some idea about God, even if they are an atheist or an agnostic, that still is some conviction about God. And furthermore, there is always a tendency within human beings to seek after transcendence, whether it is on a socio-political level, where there can be ideological critiques of how culture turns something into a secular God. For example, we could talk about money being a secular god, and so you can analyze that theologically as a idol that is then set up within humanity. And so it's a deeply human endeavor to talk about God. And so as a discipline, theology analyzes anything that involves God, which is ultimately everything. And so I hope this brief video has helped clarify a few points about what theology is. There's a lot more that could be said about the specific subdisciplines of theology, or the different methodologies or the different contexts in which theology is written. But hopefully this just gives you some framework for thinking about what theology is. I've clearly taken my own kind of take on this by using that biblical term of faith, hope, and love to kind of understand theology. But I think those are helpful ways of thinking about theology for me that hopefully are helpful also for you. And so, yeah, thanks so much for watching, and I hope you have a great day.